Before the sun fully claimed the sky, when the horizon still glowed with a faint, dusty gold, Eliza Carter stepped out of her small wooden cabin. The door creaked behind her, echoing softly into the quiet emptiness of the frontier. Morning, the air was dry, carrying the faint scent of sand and old timber. For a brief moment she paused on the porch. Glancing back inside, her mother lay on a narrow bed near the window, barely visible in the dim light. Her breathing was slow, uneven, like every breath was a battle she might lose. A damp cloth rested on her forehead, already warming under the rising heat. Eliza's eyes lingered there. Filled with worry, she never spoke out loud. Then, without a word, she turned away. In her hands she carried 2 empty metal buckets. They knocked gently against each other with every step, creating a hollow rhythm that followed her like a shadow. The path ahead stretched long and unforgiving, a narrow trail cutting through dry land, where nothing grew except stubborn patches of brittle grass. Her boots pressed into the dirt, leaving faint marks that the wind would soon erase. She walked with purpose but not ease. Every step carried weight, not just from the journey ahead, but from the responsibility resting on her shoulders. The town behind her was slowly waking. A few figures moved in the distance, silhouettes against rising sunlight. Some noticed her standing quietly as she passed. Their eyes followed her, but no one called out. No one offered help in this place. Hardship was common, and helping others was a luxury most couldn't afford. Eliza didn't look back the further she walked. The quieter the world became. The distant sounds of town faded, replaced by the whisper of wind sliding across the open land. The sun climbed higher, its warmth beginning to press down harder against her skin. Sweat gathered at her brow, but she didn't slow. This path was familiar, too familiar. Every rock, every bend, every stretch of cracked earth. She knew it all. She had walked it countless times before, and she would walk it again tomorrow. Because at the end of that path stood the well, old weathered, standing alone like a forgotten relic in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just a source of water. It was the thin line between life and loss. As Eliza finally reached the edge of it, she exhaled softly, placing the buckets down beside her. Her hands tightened slightly. As she looked down into the darkness of the well, there was no hesitation in her eyes, only determination, because for her, this wasn't just a journey. It was a promise, and she intended to keep it no matter what it cost. The well stood alone under a sky that never seemed to show mercy. By the time Eliza Carter reached it, the sun had already climbed high, enough to burn the softness out of the morning. The cool air from earlier had vanished, replaced by a dry heat that pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible weight. Her steps slowed as she approached, not from hesitation, but from exhaustion that had quietly built with every mile behind her. She didn't stop immediately, even standing beside the well. She let herself breathe for a moment longer than usual, her chest rising and falling as she tried to steady the ache inside her lungs. Dust clung to her skin, sweat traced lines down her face, catching the sunlight in small fleeting glimmers. This place had no shade, no comfort, only silence. The kind of silence that reminded you just how alone you really were. Eliza set the metal buckets down beside the well's wooden frame. The sound echoed softly into the emptiness, disappearing almost as soon as it was made. She flexed her fingers slowly, trying to ease the stiffness in her hands. The skin along her palms was rough, layered with small cuts and healing blisters, evidence of days that never gave her rest. Still, she reached for the rope. It hung coiled over the side, thick and worn from years of use. Splinters lined the wooden crank, and the fibers of the rope scratched against her skin the moment she wrapped her hands around it. She didn't flinch, she pulled. At first the movement was steady, controlled. The bucket attached to the rope disappeared into the darkness below, the faint splash echoing up from somewhere deep inside the earth. Then came the harder part, lifting it back up. Eliza leaned her weight into the rope, her arms tightening as she began to pull. The resistance was immediate. Water was heavy, far heavier than most people imagined, and today it felt heavier than ever. Her muscles strained, her breath shortened. The rope dragged slowly against the wood, inch by inch, as she forced herself not to stop. Her shoulders burned a deep, sharp ache that traveled down into her arms, but she kept pulling because stopping meant failing, and failing wasn't something she could afford. Halfway up, her grip slipped for a brief second. Panic flashed across her face as the rope jerked downward, nearly pulling free from her hands. She tightened her hold instantly, teeth clenching as she fought to regain control. The rough fibers bit into her palms, reopening old wounds, but she didn't let go. She couldn't not when everything depended on this. With one final effort, she pulled the bucket over the edge and set it down beside her. Water splashed against the sides, a small amount spilling over and soaking into the dry ground below. Eliza stared at it for a moment. It wasn't just water, it was time. It was another day her mother might survive. She didn't rest long. There was still another bucket to fill. The second pull was harder. Her arms trembled now, fatigue settling deeper into her body. Each movement felt slower, heavier, like her strength was being drained faster than she could recover it. The sun showed no mercy above her, its heat intensifying with every passing minute. By the time she finished, both buckets were full, but so was the weight pressing down on her body. She stood there for a moment staring at them, 2 simple buckets, but they might as well have been the weight of the entire world. Carefully she bent down and lifted them. The strain hit instantly, her arms pulled downward. Her shoulders tightened as she adjusted her balance. Water shifted inside the buckets with every step threatening to spill. She steadied herself, forcing her body to adapt, to endure. Then she turned back toward the trail. The walk home was always worse. Going to the well required determination. Coming back required strength. She wasn't sure she had left. Each step sent a dull pain to her legs. The ground felt hotter now. The air thicker dust rose around her feet, sticking to her skin and making every breath feel heavier. Halfway back, her pace slowed, then slowed again. Her vision glowed slightly, not enough to stop her, but enough to remind her that she was reaching her limit. She paused for a brief moment, shifting the buckets to ease the pressure in her arms, a mistake. The moment she stopped, her body wanted to stay still, to rest, to give in, but she shook her head lightly, forcing herself forward again. Because back in that cabin, someone was waiting. When the edge of town finally came into view, it didn't bring comfort, only a distance left to cover. A few townspeople stood near the main path, watching her as she approached, though expressions veiled. Some curious, some sympathetic, some completely blank. They saw her every day being her routine. But no one didn't he help him? One man leaned against a post, observing quietly. Another woman stood near a door, her eyes following Eliza's slow steps. For a moment it looked like she might step forward, but she didn't. No one did. Eliza kept walking, her focus never shifted from the path ahead. If she noticed them at all, she gave no sign. The cabin appeared at the far end of the trail, small and worn, standing against the harshness of the land, like it had no right to still be there. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The wood along its walls had faded and cracked with time, but it was still standing, and so was she. When Eliza finally reached the door, her arms felt like they might give out at any second. She set the buckets down carefully, making sure not to spill what she had fought so hard to carry. For a moment she just stood there, breathing, recovering, surviving. Then she picked them up again, pushed the door open and stepped inside, returning to the one place where all of this struggle truly mattered. Because out here in the Wild West, no one was coming to save her, and she had already accepted that. The sun was beginning its slow descent. When Eliza Carter made her way back toward the well again, it wasn't part of her usual routine to return so late, but that day had been different. Her mother's fever had risen sharply, and most of the water she'd carried that morning was already gone. Every drop mattered now, so despite the ache in her body and the warning signs, her strength was fading. Eliza had no choice but to walk that same unforgiving path again. The light had changed. The harsh white glare of midday softened into a deep, burning orange that stretched across the horizon. Shadows grew longer, stretching across the dry land like silent fingers. The air cooled slightly, but not enough to ease the exhaustion that weighed on her. By the time she reached the well, her steps were slower than ever before. Her breathing was uneven. Her hands trembled before she even touched the rope. Still she moved forward. The buckets touched the ground with a dull metallic sound. Eliza closed her eyes for a brief second, gathering what little strength she had left. Then she reached for the rope once more. But this time something felt different. A presence faint at first, then undeniable. She froze. Her fingers tightened slightly around the rope. As her eyes shifted toward the open land beyond the well, at first there was nothing, just the endless stretch of dust and fading light. Then she saw it, a figure in the distance, moving a horse and someone riding it. Eliza's body stiffened out here. Strangers were unpredictable. Some passed through without trouble. Others brought it with them. The figure drew closer, slowly, deliberately. The horse's hooves pressed softly against the dirt, each step steady and controlled. As the rider came into clearer view, the details began to take shape. A wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face, a long coat worn from travel, and a posture that spoke of someone used to long roads. And longer silences. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't threatening, but he wasn't turning away either. Eliza stepped back slightly from the well, instinct guiding her movements. Her grip on the rope loosened. Though she didn't fully let go, her eyes stayed locked on the stranger as he approached. The horse came to a stop a few feet away. Dust settled slowly around them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The man studied her quietly from atop his horse. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but what could be seen showed signs of a hard life, sun-worn skin, a strong jaw and eyes that seemed to notice more than they revealed. Finally, he swung one leg over and stepped down. His boots hit the ground with a soft thud. Still no sudden movement. No aggression, only calm. Eliza, right? He didn't say because he didn't know her name. Instead, his voice came low and steady, carrying the quiet weight of someone who chose his words carefully. You come out here alone? The question hung in the air between them. Simple but heavy. Eliza didn't answer immediately. Her instincts told her to stay guarded out here. Trust wasn't something you gave freely. It was something you protected. She had survived this long by relying on herself, by keeping her distance from strangers who asked too many questions, whose eyes narrowed slightly as she studied him in return. Trying to understand, trying to decide, the man didn't move closer. He gave her space that alone set him apart from most. After a long moment, Eliza gave a small nod. Yes. Her voice was quiet but steady. The man's gaze shifted briefly to the buckets beside her, then to the rope in her hands, then back to her face. It didn't take much to understand what was happening. You've been doing this long? He asked. Another pause. Alice hesitated again, then answered long enough. There was no complaint in her tone, no weakness, just truth. The man seemed to accept that. A faint breath left him, almost like he was considering something but not saying it yet. He walked a few closer to the well, careful, measured, making sure not to startle the horse. I've seen folks struggle out here, he said, glancing briefly into the dark opening of the well, but not many come back twice in one day. Eliza's grip tightened slightly at those words. He noticed, of course. He did. That was the kind of man he seemed to be, observant, quiet, dangerous in a way that didn't need to be spoken. But there was something else too, something softer beneath it. She looked away for a moment, her eyes falling toward the ground as if deciding how much to reveal. Finally she spoke again. I don't have a choice. The words were simple, but they carried everything. The man nodded slowly as if he understood more than she had said. Silence returned, but it wasn't as tense as before. The wind moved lightly between them, carrying dust across the ground in slow patterns. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in deeper shades of red and gold. Then, without warning, Eliza turned back to me the rope. She didn't ask for help, didn't expect it. She simply began pulling again. Her arms strained immediately, her strength already worn thin from earlier. The rope dragged against the wood as she forced it upward, her breath tightening with effort. The man watched for a second, 2 seconds. Then he stepped forward. Here. The word was quiet but firm. Eliza froze slightly, her hands still gripping the rope. She didn't let go, not yet. The man stopped just short of touching it, giving her the choice instead of taking it from her. A small but important difference. You don't have to do it alone, he added. The sentence lingered more than just an offer. Something deeper. Eliza's eyes flickered toward him. Again there was hesitation there, years of relying on no one, of trusting no one, of surviving without help. Letting someone step in wasn't easy, but her arms were shaking. Her strength was fading, and for the first time in a long time, someone had offered, slowly, carefully. She loosened her grip, not completely, but enough. Enough for him to take hold beside her. And together, for the first time, the weight began to lift. The rope creaked softly between them. As the bucket rose from the darkness, for the first time since Eliza Carter had begun making these journeys, the weight felt different, not lighter, no. The water was still heavy. The strain still real but shared, divided between 2 sets of hands instead of one. The difference was subtle in motion, but overwhelming in meaning. Eliza didn't look at him, not yet. Her eyes stayed fixed on the rope, on the movement, on anything that kept her from acknowledging what had just happened, that she had allowed someone to step into her struggle. Beside her, the cowboy worked in silence. His movements were steady, controlled, like a man who had spent years doing hard things without complaint. His grip was firm, his posture relaxed. Despite the effort, there was no show of strength, no attempt to impress, only quiet efficiency. The bucket reached the top. Together they lifted it over the edge. Water splashed gently inside, catching the last light of the setting sun. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The wind passed between them, carrying the dry scent of dust and distance. Somewhere far off, a lone bird called into the fading light, its voice echoing faintly across the open land. Eliza stepped back slightly, wiping her hands against the fabric of her dress. Her fingers trembled not just from exhaustion now, but from something she didn't fully understand. The man noticed, of course he did, but he said nothing. Instead, he walked to the second bucket and repeated the process. This time, Eliza didn't stop him. She stood quietly watching as he worked, her guarded expression slowly softening into something uncertain. Who was he? Why was he here? And more importantly, why did he care? When the second bucket was filled, he set it down beside the first and finally turned to face her fully. Up close, his presence felt different than it had from a distance, less threatening, more grounded. His face, though marked by time and travel, held a calmness that didn't belong to most men out here. He removed his hat, briefly running a hand through his hair before placing it back again. A small, respectful gesture. "My name's Daniel," he said. His voice carried low, steady, like someone who didn't need to raise it to be heard. Eliza hesitated. Names held weight. They made things real, and real connections were dangerous. Still, after a moment, she answered Eliza. The word came quietly, almost like she wasn't used to saying it to anyone anymore. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging it without pressing further. Another silence settled between them, but this one wasn't as sharp. It lingered. Then after a moment, his gaze shifted, not to the buckets, not to the path, but back to her, and something in his expression changed. Not curiosity, not suspicion, something deeper, careful, measured, like he was choosing his next words with intention. "You shouldn't have to do this alone," he said. The sentence was simple, but it carried weight far beyond its words. Eliza's reaction was immediate. Even if subtle, her shoulders tensed slightly. Her eyes shifted away from his, focusing instead on the horizon where the sun was now dipping lower, painting the sky in deep red fading gold. "I've managed," she replied. There was strength in her tone, but also distance. A quiet wall she had built over time. Daniel studied her for a moment. He didn't challenge her. He didn't argue. He simply observed. Then after a brief pause, he asked the question, the one that would change everything. "Are you all alone out here?" The words hung in the air. With a sudden shift in the wind, Eliza froze, not physically, not completely, but something inside her stopped. That question, it reached further than anything he had said before, further than the well, further than the jury. It touched the pole of who she kept buried in routine responsibility. For a long moment she said nothing. Her mind moved quickly, measuring risk, weighing trust. We played every lesson she had learned about surviving in a place like this. Don't trust strangers. Don't give them more than they need. Don't show weakness. But this wasn't just a stranger asking out of curiosity. There was something in his voice. Something real. She looked at him again, really looked this time. And what she saw wasn't danger. It wasn't creepy. It wasn't anything she had learned to fear. It was understanding, like he already knew what the answer might be. Like he had asked the question not to pry, but to confirm for Black's load. And then quiet, she answered no. The world was soft, but it didn't end there. There was a pause, a hesitation. And then my mother, she's still alive. The way she said it made it clear. The old Daniel's expression didn't change much. But something in his mind kicked in. A deeper focus, a silent acknowledgement. She's sick, the wise. I continued, her voice steady now, so still quiet. Slowly, like they hadn't been spoken out loud in a long time. She can't walk, can barely drink. Some days she stopped for a moment, swallowing slightly. Some days I don't know if she's still with me or not. The wind moved between them again. But now it carried something heavier. Truth. Daniel didn't interrupt. Didn't offer empty comfort. He just listened fully, completely. And that was something Eliza hadn't experienced in a long time. I bring the water, she said, gesturing faintly toward the buckets. That's all I can do. There was no self-pity in her voice. No complaint, only acceptance. And that made it harder to hear. Daniel looked down briefly at the ground, then back at her. How long, he asked. Eliza shook her head slightly. Long enough. The same answer as before, but now it meant more. Silence followed again, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with everything she had just shared, everything she had been carrying alone. The sun slipped lower, nearly touching the horizon now. Shadows stretched long across the land, wrapping around the well like the closing of a chapter. Daniel took a slow breath, then made a decision. You shouldn't have to carry all of this by yourself, he said, not as a question, not as a suggestion, but as something firm, something certain. Eliza didn't respond immediately, because part of her wanted to believe him, and another part didn't know how. Out here, promises didn't last. People didn't stay, and help always came with a cost. She looked down at the buckets, then back at the path leading home, then finally at him. Her eyes held something new now. Not trust, not yet, but something close, something beginning. Why, she asked quietly. One word, but it carried everything she needed to know. Why help? Why stay? Why care? Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. For a moment it seemed like he might not answer, then simply because someone should. No grand speech, no explanation, just truth. And somehow that was enough to break through the silence she had lived in for so long. The light faded further. Night was coming. And for the first time since this struggle began, Eliza Carter didn't feel completely alone standing beside that well. The last light of the sun faded behind the horizon as Eliza and Daniel began the walk back. This time she wasn't alone. The difference wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no sudden shift in the world around them. The land was still dry, the path still long, the air still heavy with dust. But something had changed in a way that couldn't be seen. Only felt Daniel carried both buckets. At first Eliza had resisted. "I can take one," she had said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. But Daniel had simply shaken his head. "You've been taking both long enough." There was no argument in his tone, no force, just quiet certainty, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain. She didn't fight him again. They walked side by side in silence. The rhythm of their steps replaced the loneliness that had once followed her every journey. The buckets no longer clanged in her hands. The weight that used to drag her shoulders down was gone for now, and in its place was something unfamiliar. Relief, small, fragile, but real. The sky darkened slowly above them, the last traces of red giving way to deep blue. A few early stars began to appear, faint at first, then clearer as the night settled in. The wind cooled slightly, brushing against their clothes. Carrying the scent of dry earth in distance, Eliza glanced at him once, then quickly looked away. She wasn't used to this. Walking beside someone, not needing to rush, not needing to prove she could do it all alone. It felt strange and yet not wrong. When the cabin finally came into view, Daniel slowed slightly, his eyes taking in the small structure. From a distance, it stood just as it always had, fragile, worn and holding on through time and hardship. But now he saw it differently. Not just a building, a life inside it, a struggle. As they reached the door, Eliza stepped ahead and pushed it open. The familiar creak echoed into the quiet interior. Daniel followed, carefully stepping inside. Setting the buckets down with more care than most men would show, he looked around. The cabin was small, simple. Everything inside it told a story of survival, not comfort. The table was worn smooth from years of use. The chair creaked with the slightest movement. The walls carried the marks of time, cracks, faded wood, signs of seasons that had come and gone without mercy. Then his eyes moved to the bed, and everything else faded away. Eliza's mother lay there just as she had described. But the reality was heavier than words. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. Each rise of her chest looked uncertain, like it took more effort than it should. The womb itself seemed to hold its breath around her, as if even the air understood how fragile the moment was. Daniel stepped closer slowly, not out of curiosity but respect. He had seen sickness before, he had seen people faint. But something about this, something about the way Eliza stood beside that bed, watching, waiting, holding on, it settled deep inside him. "She's worse than yesterday," Eliza said quietly, moving to her mother's side. There was no panic in her voice, only truth, and that made it harder. Daniel didn't answer right away. He simply nodded once, his jaw tightening slightly, as he took in the full weight of what he was seeing. Eliza dipped the cloth into the fresh water again, placing it gently on her mother's forehead. The movement was careful, practiced, something she had done countless times before. "She used to be stronger than anyone I knew," Eliza mooed. Her voice softened, not breaking but close. "She used to kill me everything so I wouldn't have to." There was a pause, a quiet moment where memory met reality, and now she stopped, her eyes lowering slightly. "I can't even help her the way she helped me." Daniel watched her, and in that moment, something shifted inside him. This wasn't just a passing encounter anymore. This wasn't just helping someone at a well. This was something real, something that mattered. Without saying anything, he turned back toward the buckets and began pouring water into a small basin. His movements were natural, unforced, like he had already decided he belonged there. Even if only for now, Eliza noticed. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. The words were automatic, a habit, a defense. Daniel didn't look at her when he answered. "I know, simple do it." Then he added, "But I'm not leaving." The room fell silent again. But this time it felt different. Not empty, not heavy, just still. Eliza didn't respond, because part of her wanted to question it, to doubt it, to push him away, before she could rely on something that might disappear. But another part, the part that was tired, the part that had been carrying everything along for too long. Didn't have the strength to argue. That night Daniel stayed, not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as someone who had quietly stepped into a space that had been empty for too long, near the door, adjusted the small fire to keep the room warm through the night, checked the water, making sure it was within reach. Small things but meaningful. Eliza watched it all in silence. She didn't thank him, didn't question him. She just let it happen, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she sat down, without the weight of the entire world pressing on her shoulders. Later, as the night deepened and the stars filled the sky outside, Eliza sat beside her mother, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Daniel stood near the window, looking out toward the dark trail that led back to the well. He could leave right out before morning, disappear like most men in his position would, but he didn't move. Because somewhere between that question at the well and this quiet, fragile cabin, he had found something worth staying for, and in the Wild West that was rare. Behind him, Eliza's voice broke the silence. Soft, almost uncertain. Daniel, he turned slightly. She hesitated. Then, thank you. 2 simple words, but they carried everything she hadn't been able to say before. Daniel nodded once, no smile. No speech, just understanding. Outside, the wind moved across the land once more. But inside that small cabin, for the first time, the burden wasn't hers alone anymore.
The night did not feel like night anymore. Inside the small wooden cabin, time moved differently, slower, heavier, as if the world outside had forgotten this place existed. The fire in the corner cracked softly, throwing warm orange light across the walls. Shadows shifted gently with every flicker, stretching and shrinking like silent witnesses. Eliza sat beside her mother's bed. She hadn't moved for a long time. Her eyes were tired, not just from one day, but from many days stacked on top of each other like stones she had been forced to carry alone. Her hands rested loosely in her lap now, no longer shaking as much. Exhaustion had taken everything it could, leaving behind a strange stillness. Across the room, Daniel stood near the table. He wasn't sleeping. Men like him rarely did in places they didn't fully trust or fully belong to yet. His coat hung slightly open, his hat resting on the edge of a chair. He watched the fire quietly, but his attention wasn't on it. It was on her, and on the bed. Eliza's mother's breathing was weaker than before. Not gone, but fading. Every breath felt like it had to fight its way back into her body. The kind of breathing that made silence feel louder. Eliza noticed every detail. She always did. Her fingers slowly reached for the damp cloth again, but halfway there she stopped. Not because she didn't want to help, but because she realized something painful. There was less she could do now than ever before. Her throat tightened slightly, not with panic, but with helplessness. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. He moved closer, quietly, stopping a few steps behind her. "You should rest," he said softly. Eliza didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared at her mother's face. "I can't," she replied. Her voice wasn't stubborn anymore. It was tired, honest. A pause followed. Then she added, quieter, "If I sleep, and something happens." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Daniel understood. He had seen that kind of fear before, the kind that didn't come from danger outside, but from loss waiting quietly inside a room. He stepped closer, slowly. "You've been awake too long," he said. "I'll watch her." Eliza finally turned her head toward him. For a moment, she looked like she might refuse again, like that instinct to carry everything alone would rise one more time. But it didn't. Not fully, because she was too tired to fight it anymore. After a long silence, she nodded once, barely. Then she leaned back against the wall, still sitting beside her mother, but allowing her body to rest for the first time that day. Her eyes didn't close, but they softened. Outside, the wind moved across the desert again, brushing against the cabin walls. Somewhere far off, a coyote called into the night, long, lonely, fading into silence. Time passed, slowly, unevenly. Daniel sat near the table now, keeping watch. Every so often, he checked the water, adjusted the fire, or simply looked toward the bed. He didn't speak. He didn't try to fill the silence. He just stayed. And in a place like this, staying mattered more than words. Hours later, a small sound broke the stillness.
Eliza's mother shifted slightly. Not much, but enough to catch attention. Eliza sat up instantly, alert, her exhaustion forgotten in a second. "Ma," she whispered. Her voice trembled just slightly now. Daniel stood as well, moving closer without rushing. The older woman's eyes fluttered faintly. For a moment, there was a change. Not dramatic, not sudden, but real. Her breathing steadied just a little. Her fingers moved slightly against the blanket. Eliza leaned forward, holding her hand carefully. "I'm here," she said quickly. "I'm here, Ma." Her voice broke, not loudly, but deeply, like something inside her had finally cracked open after being held too tightly for too long. Daniel watched quietly. He didn't interrupt, didn't speak, because some moments didn't belong to anyone else. They belonged to the people surviving them. Minutes passed. The change didn't become a miracle. It didn't erase the sickness, but it became something else. A pause. A moment where life refused to leave completely. And that was enough to make Eliza close her eyes for a second. Not in defeat, but in relief she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. When she opened them again, she looked at Daniel. Really looked. Not as a stranger, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had stayed when it mattered. "Why did you help us?" she asked quietly. The same question from before, but now it carried deeper weight. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then glanced at the bed, then back at her. His answer came slower this time. "Because I've seen what it's like," he said, "to be alone when you shouldn't be." A pause. Then, "And I decided I wasn't going to let it happen again, if I could stop it." Eliza didn't speak, but something in her expression changed. Not fully trust, not yet, but something close to belief. Outside, the first day was just beginning to break the...
A faint line of pale light breaking through the darkness at the edge of the horizon. The world was waking up again. But inside the cabin, something else was happening. Not an ending, not a miracle, but a beginning. Eliza slowly stood, walking to the small window. She watched the light grow stronger over the desert, touching the land she had walked alone for so long. Now, it didn't feel the same. Behind her, Daniel spoke quietly. "I'll head into town today," he said. "Get what I can. Medicine. Supplies." Eliza turned slightly. "You don't have to." "I know," he interrupted gently. A pause. Then, softer. "But I am." Silence followed again. But this time, it didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like direction. Eliza walked back to her mother's side, sitting down once more. She held her hand tightly, not out of fear anymore, but presence. "I was alone for a long time," she said quietly. Daniel nodded slightly. "Not anymore," he replied. The sun finally rose over the horizon. Light filled the cabin slowly, warming the wood, the air, the space between them. And for the first time, in a land that had taken so much, it gave something back. Hope. Not loud, not perfect, but real.